Day 51. The Green Gardens and the Tablelands Trail. I woke up a little later than normal, ready to tackle another adventure that would be in my memories for the remainder of my life. I knew that it was important to have such epic adventures throughout this trip. These adventures made everything worthwhile, from the sacrifices I made prior to the trip to the challenges I faced during the trip. These adventures are what I wanted to share with the world. Remembering the conversation I had 2 days ago with the Frenchman from St. Pierre and Miquelon, I decided to hike the Green Gardens Trail. The weather was absolutely perfect. It was early September, and being late summer, the temperature wasn't brutally hot. Along with the Green Gardens Trail, I would also hike the Tablelands Trail, a truly interesting hike not far away from the Green Gardens Trail, but unlike the Green Gardens Trail, which followed the coastline, the Tablelands Trail was directly on an exposed portion of the Earth's mantle. Yesterday was a day that I spent doing my laundry, catching up on tasks such as emails, cleaning out my beast, and regular duties that I had to undertake while on the road. I spent the entire day in Corner Brook, which was surprisingly a much larger and bigger city than I expected it to be. While I kept my car camping spot at this local park just off the highway at Deer Lake, Corner Brook had all the amenities of a small city that I would need to get by. But now that I had everything in order, it was time for me to return to nature and explore the wonders of Newfoundland. I punched in my destination on Google Maps, which led to Highway 430 heading northwest from Deer Lake, until I branched off onto Highway 431 heading towards the ocean. I passed by Bond Bay and a few other small communities along the way in this picturesque drive. Around the time I took the final turn towards the road leading to both the Green Gardens Trail and the Tablelands Trail, the terrain changed dramatically. It was actually quite surreal, almost like I was on another planet or some made-up fantasy realm. One side of the highway seemed lush, green, and full of vegetation, yet the other side of the highway seemed barren, almost lifeless. The terrain and geography of Newfoundland was easily the most beautiful I've seen so far in my trip. I found the Green Gardens Trail just off the highway, parked, and started to get set up. Despite not having any obligations to anyone, after all, I've been unemployed since starting my cross-country road trip, I was still feeling rushed. I wanted to finish the Green Gardens Trail as soon as possible, as I was going to hike the Tablelands Trail just down the road right after. I also wanted to push myself physically, as I have been rather inactive and I was nowhere near as physically fit I was back when I was living in Victoria. I did my stretches, laced on my hiking boots, grabbed some food and water, then finally started the trail. The trail itself was very well maintained, and there wouldn't be any bushwhacking involved. Not that bushwhacking or self-navigation bothered me. The terrain here wasn't as lifeless as the other side of the highway, but it was definitely quite interesting to see how there were tan-colored rocks with sparse vegetation in the area. The beginning of the trail itself was relatively flat, but in the distance I could see heavily forested hills and a few glimpses of the ocean. As I ventured further along the trail, the vegetation dramatically changed along with the terrain. The tan-colored, desert-like setting withered away and was replaced with nutrient-rich soils and trees that were more fitting for the area. The trail meandered along the forest with signs of possible forest fires or insect damage in certain regions. Entire areas of forest seemed like a graveyard of trees, while the remaining trees seemed full of life. It was an incredible change from how the trail started off. Eventually, the trail started to descend where I could see the ocean. During this time, I could also feel the familiar ocean breeze, a feeling that I knew so well that told me that I was on the right side of the country. When I arrived, there were already other hikers along the path. I just happened to run into a few along the way. Another young couple were there taking pictures through the openings in the trees, and I decided to do the same. It was quite beautiful, as everything I had seen so far in Newfoundland was. There were some rock formations off the shore, and I wasn't quite sure how they came to be, but it would have been cool to kayak up to them and attempt to climb them. However, given what I was able to see from the shore, I could also imagine the ocean currents to be particularly strong. The Green Gardens Trail definitely didn't disappoint me. The sky was clear and sunny. It wasn't hot, and unlike many trails back in Western Canada, the trail wasn't packed with tourists. With the exception of the higher costs, it was a wonder to me that the people didn't visit Newfoundland as much as the rest of the country. I was standing a safe distance from the cliff, but through the trees, I could see the stunning coastline and the ocean below. Gratitude was never far away from me, as I knew that this was something very few people would ever get a chance to experience. The Green Gardens Trail was truly majestic in every way. I continued along the trail, which from an elevation followed the coastline high up on a cliff, with trees preventing the harsh winds from battering the hikers, as well as preventing the hikers from falling down to the beach below. The forest itself had thick vegetation and numerous streams, even a waterfall. I had no knowledge on plant life, but everything that I had seen indicated this particular stretch of forest was very healthy. By this time, I began slowing down from my rush, trying to take in everything around me. What was the sense of finishing this quickly? I had to savor the moment and, if possible, freeze this moment in time. The start of the trail was barren with very little vegetation, and now as I arrived at the ocean, the landscape was filled with life. It reminded me of how unhappy I was just prior to my trip, and how that changed as I took this adventure of a lifetime, traveling across the country. Looking down at the beach, it was surreal. The dark, rocky shore, with the waves coming in, was something I would never forget. The cold Atlantic waters were coming in and shaping the shoreline in front of me. I could only imagine the stories that this terrain held over the thousands or millions of years. As I continued further, I eventually reached a lookout point with brightly painted Adirondack chairs overlooking the cliffs. This would be a nice scenic place to watch the sunrise or the sunset. I found a plaque nearby with a map indicating the Green Gardens Trail was actually a loop. However, a large connecting section was closed off for maintenance. Not that there would have been time to explore this loop anyways, as I was planning on hiking the Tablelands right after. I continued onwards, wandering through the meadow around the cliff, checking out several vantage points where I could look out into the endless Atlantic Ocean. While Prince Edward Island's rocky shoreline was rusty red with its iron-rich terrain, here in Newfoundland the shoreline was dark, nearly black from volcanic activity. At least that's what my guess was. The cliff stood quite tall, easily 30 meters or taller, so I naturally stayed at a safe distance. But it was still a sight to behold. Just past the Adirondack chairs was a steep staircase leading down to the shore. I ventured down this staircase until I reached the bottom, where I was greeted by some of the most beautiful scenery I could have imagined. I was at a loss of words to describe this entire trail. While I had visited some incredible places throughout my adventures traveling across Canada, Newfoundland was something out of a storybook. The nature was untamed, untouched, the way it should be. I was standing at the shore with the water crashing at my feet. The endless sounds of rhythmic waves combined with the clattering of the rocks was like nature's drumbeat. High above, the sky was clear, mimicking the calmness that came over me since arriving in Newfoundland. Here I was, on the other side of the country from my current home, standing on soil that I have never stood on before, feeling free during a time of restriction, and feeling peace during a time of chaos. The Green Gardens Trail was more than just a trail, much more than just a trek into the wilderness of Newfoundland. It was a place where one's heart could be set free. I looked back at the cliffs that I descended from, and the rocky terrain as well as the windswept trees at the top. The shoreline had washed up the trees and other natural debris from the ocean. Thankfully, it wasn't littered like some of the other places I've visited. The dark, rocky terrain that the cliffs were comprised of almost seemed like it would have been a great place to try climbing. Although I had never climbed outdoors, I have always wanted to. I thought that it would be a great attempt at something like this in the future, if permitted in this park. This particular beach was almost crescent-shaped, with a small cove where water would pool up, and it seemed like a cool place where one could climb up on the cliff and jump directly into the water. Off in the distance, there were other rocky formations jutting out of the ocean, where a kayaker could easily kayak to, and then climb atop to enjoy lunch in the middle of the ocean. Of course, these were all activities that would be much easier to think of than to execute. The waves came in quite strong, indicating the current around this western side of Newfoundland. I retraced my steps and headed back up the steep set of stairs, and I found myself back on top of the cliffs. I continued along the pathway, enjoying the views in every direction. Occasionally, I would walk right up to the cliff and precariously peer down at the ocean below. This particular area was quite lush with vegetation and biodiversity compared to the beginning of the trail. I continued walking along the path as it became muddier. Eventually, I found the sheep that the Frenchman from St. Pierre and Miquelon mentioned just days ago. I counted 8 sheep, and they were all just chilling under a tree. They were actually quite gross, taking a dump and a piss in the same area that they laid down on. But I knew they were just animals, so hygiene in a human sense was something that didn't cross their minds. I kept my distance as I didn't want to disturb them, and I did notice that there were tags on their ears. I would have been quite upset to find out if these sheep were not protected by hunters or poachers. After enjoying the views of the sheep, I continued onwards until a sign indicated that the remainder of the path was closed due to maintenance. I therefore retraced my steps, encountering a couple that I had seen in the beginning of my trek. They were quite surprised that I was already on my way back, and commented on my physique. I laughed and I told them I just try hard, and I'm not really in great shape at all. I bid them a wonderful day and briskly hiked back to my beast. I passed by many of the beautiful views that I had seen earlier, looking out towards the ocean. Numerous times I thought of how peaceful life would be if I never had to worry about trivial things ever again. But I knew that the only place like that which existed was heaven, and I was far away from ever getting there. Around midway of the trail, I started to develop blisters on my ankles. I came to the realization that the hiking boots I purchased just before my trip were a size too small. The lush vegetation eventually gave way and began to return to the barren, desert-like terrain. The pain from my blisters was nearly in full force, and despite the pain, I moved faster as I wanted to relieve myself and remove my shoes. Plus, I also knew that I still had another epic trek ahead of me. The pain became nearly searing, as I felt the agony with every step, but I thought of how this experience must come at a cost. Eventually, I reached my beast and took a quick rest before heading out to the Tablelands. Even though it was merely a 10-minute drive down the road, I removed my shoes just to allow my feet to rest. After emptying my bladder, changing my bloodied socks, and eating a little bit, I backtracked down the road to the Tablelands Trail. Along the way, there was a road blockage as there was some maintenance crew repairing the road. This gave me an opportunity to stop and take a few pictures of the surrounding environment. The surrounding terrain took millions, if not billions, of years to reach this point, and though the earth was ever evolving, I felt that this was so beautiful it should be frozen in time. I peered at the expansive hills that were in all directions, as if the road cut a clear path through these hills. Once the maintenance crew finished up, they flagged me across where I gave them a wave. I felt at home here in Newfoundland, in Atlantic Canada. The friendliness of the people was one of the best reasons to come home. I found the parking lot for the Tablelands Trail, parked right away, and prepared myself for the trek. I knew I had limited time, and unlike most visitors, I planned on taking the entire loop. As my research showed, there was a walkway that led up to a viewpoint, but the entire trail can be done in a loop. My research also indicated that it was rather difficult, but looking back at all the crazy damn hikes and death-defying treks I've done in British Columbia, I had the confidence that I could easily tackle the Tablelands Trail. There were a number of plaques along the way that also warned visitors of the difficulties of the Tablelands Trail during the winter, as well as the loop as it was unmarked and unmaintained. Into the deep expanse of adventure was what my life was about, so I was more than happy to see this. Looking all around me, I was still quite mesmerized by the numerous hills in this region. I never thought that Newfoundland would look like this. The terrain was tan, rocky, and nearly barren of vegetation. My research also indicated that this was one of the few places on Earth where one could walk directly on Earth's mantle, as this was what the rocky terrain was comprised of. There are a number of streams crossing over the path whose origin was not known to me, obviously from something up one of the hills. But given that this was September, and it was quite warm, I couldn't imagine this was from rainfall. I did see how water did carve into the cliffs in the distance, and the fast-moving water eventually would make its way to the ocean. The parking lot had a lot of cars. I wasn't the only one hiking this trail. Whether or not I would be the only one taking the loop was a different story. Just like the Green Gardens Trail earlier, the trail was very well maintained and marked, at least so far. As I drew closer to the bowl, the scenic viewpoint, the vegetation began to disappear. The tan-colored rocks took over. Some of these rocks were rather small, but some of them large enough to be considered a boulder. Eventually, the path became an elevated walkway that followed a small, fast-moving creek. At the end of the elevated walkway marked the beginning of the loop trail, the unmarked and unmaintained section, which led up the cliff, around the top of the bowl, and then back down. When I arrived, there were a number of people there taking pictures, but a lot of them were surprised as I didn't hesitate to continue trekking further. As I continued walking up the area known as the bowl, the fast-moving creek turned larger, almost into a river, in the midst of this near barren, alien-like landscape. The winds were surprisingly strong considering the area was enclosed and far away from the ocean, but I imagined that the winds came rushing off the cliffs and down the bowl, following the water. After leaving the lookout point earlier, the remainder of the trail was all self-navigation. Looking around in all directions, the bowl was surprisingly immense. Basically, it was like a semicircular shape with cliffs all around. Combined with a barren landscape, it was otherworldly. I met another Frenchman on his way up as well, and while I programmed the route on an app on my phone, I just navigated my way as best as I could. The Frenchman mentioned that I just had to look for the cairns. While there were some visible cairns along the way, I knew the general direction, and there were still some hikers on their way up to the top like myself. I did notice some other hikers were descending, appearing as if they only ventured to the top and no further. The outer edges of the bowl had gradual slopes, while the intersections of the bowl were extremely steep. I did notice a small path through the steep section, and it was around this moment that the actual difficulty of this trek set in. I burned through all of the water I had left, and the blisters I had from the Green Gardens Trail earlier made every step more painful. That, combined with having to boulder hop, made the ascent physically and mentally draining. I continued to clamber up the cliffs, ascending parallel to the waterfall cascading down from the top. With sheer determination, knowing that I may not ever get an opportunity to do this again in my lifetime, I pushed through the agony of the painful blisters and the relentless thirst of my dehydrated body to continue. As I was ascending, the real beauty of the Tablelands Trail set in. I would look back at the distance where I started, seeing the crowds thin out as the sun began to set. I could see the ocean in the distance, and the roar of the waterfall parallel to me combined with the wind was near deafening. I struggled to maintain a decent pace, knowing that, at this point, it was too late for me to turn back. I made the decision to complete the Tablelands Trail, and I would complete it. Remembering how I didn't complete the Theodore Fricker Mountain Trail back on Cape Breton Island, and how I nearly abandoned the Starlight Trail just days ago, I knew that I had the relentless mindset of accomplishing what I set out to accomplish. Taking all the negativity I experienced back in Victoria just prior to my trip, I used that as fuel to fire me up and keep me going forward. To hell with my pain. To hell with my thirst. This challenge I would complete, and I knew that I had to enjoy every moment, no matter how difficult, because in a short period of time, I would be back at my beast, remembering this very moment. Eventually, I reached the top, where I took a quick break. It was surprisingly chilly with the strong winds here, and there were numerous pools of water. I wasn't quite sure the origin of this water, but it was surprisingly cold. I reached the top of the bowl, looked in the distance at the small town I passed on my way to this trail, as well as the Green Gardens Trail. Although of all of the Atlantic provinces I visited, I knew that I had a single word to label all of them. New Brunswick I would label as boring. Prince Edward Island I would label as charming. Nova Scotia I would label as home. And Newfoundland I would label as surreal. And this was truly surreal. At the top of the bowl, I stood on what appeared to be a plateau, overlooking the vast, rocky landscape of Earth's mantle at my feet. The roar of the waterfall just below me and the wind howling past me was so loud, but the loudest thing I could hear was my heartbeat. While I was far from finished with the trail, I had a sense of accomplishment come over me. I stopped for a moment in what seemed far longer than reality, just to take everything in. Then, as if that moment was over, I snapped back into beast mode. I was alone, all alone at the top. When I looked back down at the trail, no one was at the viewpoint. No one was ascending to the top. Everyone had left. I was the only one left on this trail. Strange. It was just me and the Tablelands. Or so I thought. While I still had the beast mode mentality running through me, I couldn't ignore the pain or the thirst I was feeling, almost like trying to run away from an enemy that was constantly clutching at me. I pushed myself harder as I knew I was battling not only my physical state, but the environment around me. The sun was setting, and I didn't have a flashlight. Traversing on and around these boulders in the dark would certainly lead to more injury. But then came something in the distance that surprised me. A young man in the distance was hiking the loop as well. He was around 100 meters away from me, and while he was quite quick, almost as if he had done this trail numerous times, I knew that no matter what, I would make sure I could keep him in sight. I would follow his trail. Just as long as I could see him, I knew I would be in good hands. Some supernatural thoughts entered my mind. Was this a sign from God? A messenger? A guardian angel? Someone to help me find my way through this terrain safely? I wasn't sure. And I would probably never know. But my mind forced my body to follow commands, and my body followed each command with agony. Through the pain and thirst, I kept this young man in my sights. Strangely, he never once turned around to look at me. But during certain times when my body was fighting itself, the young man in the distance would coincidentally stop, almost as if he wanted me to catch up. While I took numerous pictures with my camera throughout the Green Gardens Trail, as well as the Tablelands Trail, at this point I was only taking pictures sporadically. I had to maintain a good distance from this young man and follow him back to the parking lot. Eventually he began to descend along the path, and I followed in pursuit. In the distance, I could make out the parking lot as well as the main trail. From this vantage point, I felt much more safe, but I knew it certainly wasn't over. By now, I was in the shadow of the bowl, descending, and the darkness was really starting to set in. The temperature dropped significantly since the sun was disappearing, but I still pushed myself harder to make sure that I could keep up to this young man in the distance. By now, I could easily see the main path, and I knew I was relatively safe, but I didn't want to take that for granted. From a distance, I watched the young man as he met up with another person on the main trail. I was eager to get back to my beast, as if she was waiting for my safe return. Most of the pressure of completing the trail had dissipated, although the pain from my blisters and the constant thirst was still beating on my body relentlessly. Eventually, I made it back to the main path, and as briskly as I could, I hobbled back to the parking lot and back to my beast. The young man and his companion waiting for him had already left, and I was the last person there. Or so I thought. Again. I was replenishing myself with food and water when a minivan pulled right up next to me, almost blocking me. I noticed it had Ontario plates on it, and while I was annoyed at first and felt like I was going to shout at the driver exited and started a conversation with me. It turned out that the driver was very friendly, even introduced me to his family, and said he was surprised to see a vehicle with British Columbia plates on it. He said he was from Etobicoke, and I was quite surprised as I told him about my incredible experience in Toronto and how I was staying in Etobicoke during my travels. He also mentioned he had visited Vancouver previously, and he had been road tripping with his family for some time. We chatted up for a while, and then I bid him farewell and safe travels as I took the hour-long drive back to Deer Lake. I was still in quite a bit of pain during my drive back to my stealth car camping spot, but it still wasn't over. I pulled up to the North Atlantic petrol station where I took a much-needed shower at the shower use facility and then had delicious junk food at the Dairy Queen next door. By then my body was clean, replenished, but extremely fatigued. I drove back to my stealth car camping spot and prepared myself to sleep. It was dark out, and I was all by myself. Unlike the previous few days where there were other cars camping beside me, I found myself all alone, just like the entirety of my trip. alone. But this was peace. I gently laid down and reflected on the people that I have met, the challenges that I have faced, and the memorable experience I had during this cross-country road trip. What an adventure, and today was another one that could have cost me dearly. I thought about the young man that I had followed through the Tablelands trail and how instrumental he was in helping guide me and motivate me to complete the loop. Even though I would never meet him in this lifetime, I silently wished him the best and thanked him for his assistance. I closed my eyes as my thoughts faded to dreams, not knowing the next adventure that would lay in store for me tomorrow.
Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.